The 1980s was the best gaming decade, bar none. Like every great art form, it was the time period just after it had been created, but before it became overly mainstream, that video games literally blasted into our living rooms. You could even go so far as to call it the Renaissance period of gaming, and I will.
The 80s is where I began my personal love affair with gaming.
Back in the 80s, when I was a gamer, it was all about Spectrums and Commodore 64s, and then later the Amiga.
Very much the birth of so many concepts that are still kind of effective today.
I think the 80s was the most important decade because people played games when they were almost all universally awful, because the 80s was boring. It was like a giant 80s party. You couldn't leave.
The 80s was the first and the last decade where gaming captured the imagination of the public at large. It was a period where computers and video games felt like they had unlimited potential. If you want any proof of that, just look at some of the films they were making back then.
Stop! I'm warning you. I'm gonna have to put you on the game grid.
David Lightman was a master at computer games.
It started with a game. Last Starfighter.
You're gonna bust the record!
The Last Starfighter, exactly. You know, there it was. We were going to be these kids. We were going to lead the world into a bigger and brighter future, and technology was the way we were going to do it.
Apparently, if you spill champagne on a computer, it will start interrupting your love life and fall in love with your girlfriend and steal her. These are great concepts. Why don't they make films like this anymore?
We are still suffering from the hangover of how Hollywood represented gaming in the 80s.
This computer company is coming out with these amazing new games in a couple of months.
And I want to play those games.
These microcomputers were still surrounded in mystery, thanks mainly to an information-starved environment. We didn't have internet or search engines, so we had to rely on things like magazines, word of mouth, and even urban legend. Sometimes you'd make an important purchase based solely on the box art alone.
You picked up the box and there was this fantastic box art, and you'd get home and put it in the console and, okay, doesn't quite match that, but it doesn't matter.
When you bought a game then, all you had to go on was the box art, so it was just so all-important.
I did buy some games that pretty much had hand-drawn box art at the time because the title sounded cool, or was like, oh, does this game look anything like the artwork on the box? Spoiler, they didn't.
It was an era of high stakes, to say the least. Permadeath was the norm, with home games matching the coin-guzzling fury of the arcades. Ah, yes, the arcades. When you think about it, they were all dark dungeons full of delinquent deviants, but it was where you could get the best gaming hardware, and the newest.
Is that moment of walking into a room and seeing something that will just dazzle you for the first time.
Word would go around the arcade that you were on the second last or third last level, and gradually people would come around, so you'd be surrounded by, 20, 30 people.
I have no idea what my high score was. I was in the top 3 for a while, but a guy with some pretty questionable initials eventually bumped me off.
Games back in the 80s were just harder. The spoiled gamers of today find the difficulty of something like Dark Souls a jarring experience, and that's actually kind of sad. Back in the day, games would kick your butt and you would love every minute of it.
You know how the save points in games back then were just really hard? And I'd got halfway through a really difficult level and I had left the console on overnight and I was petrified that my housemate was going to come home and turn it off.
There was a bit they put in the middle of the game where you had to jump over a river, and my friend and I would beat each other up in real life because he would headbutt me into the river.
By definition, this face-melting difficulty also lent to a game's longevity. If you couldn't actually finish a game, well, it kind of lasted forever. Some of today's games are way too much like today's movies, where you forget the story and the plot by the time the credits start rolling. The 80s sparked our imaginations and the imaginations of small indie development teams, who in turn flooded the market with every sort of game you could imagine.
It was almost like the Wild West, because people were just creating these games on teams of 2 if you were lucky. There was no real definition of what made the game good or what made the game bad. People were just pulling it out.
I've not had any less fun having to play a llama or an egg, or some of the strange things that 80s video games made me play. They were still really addictive fun.
There's a reason so many games today are going retro, revisiting old gameplay and graphic styles that were not only born in that era, but they were also tough enough to stand the test of time and still be around today. And there's no other genre tougher than the scrolling beat-em-up. Double Dragon, Altered Beast, Golden Axe. In these worlds, a stroll down the street was a fight for justice, masculinity unbound. In the 80s, if a game asked you if you were a bad enough dude to rescue the president, it was a rhetorical question. Unlike today's gaming heroes, racked by uncertainty and guilt. And I haven't even touched on the aesthetics of the technology itself. Today we've got hard drives, soulless little black boxes, but back then we had floppy disks. Snug in their little paper envelopes, they were physical, they were visceral.
If you knew enough people, you had access to all the games. There was a lot of playground sharing going on back in those days.
Flicking through a disc box was as satisfying as browsing a vinyl record collection. Every chunk of gaming hardware had an unmistakable physical presence.
This is how long I've been gaming. My first console was made of wood. Wood.
Then we were introduced to the two frontrunners in the console race of the 80s.
The Nintendo Entertainment System.
Only on the Sega system. Sega.
The NES and the Master System. I'm just going to give you a moment and let that nostalgia really sink in. Today, these things are relics to be collected, hunted down out of old dusty cupboards and proudly put out on display. Above all, this was an era of art through adversity. The technical limitations of the time didn't actually constrain the game makers, it liberated them. Famously, Shigeru Miyamoto made the most of his chunky pixels, and he gave Mario exaggerated features. To this very day, he's defined by his overalls, his nose, his hat and his mustache.
And he didn't speak, like when he jumped, there was no wahoo. He just silent, got on with the job, did his plumbing, got rid of the monkey, rescued. He didn't even have a princess girlfriend back then.
When confronted with lo-fi synthesizer chips, composers rose to the challenge, their soaring synth symphonies still echoing through the years. Just look at the soaring popularity of chiptunes. The technology moves forward, but the aesthetic remains. Why? Because it's retro, because it's just so cool. Now, admittedly, I only got 5 out of these 10 amazing years, but that hasn't stopped me, like many others, going out and embracing my hipster gamer, playing some of these incredible games, collecting these classic consoles, all just so I could relive a brief moment of this amazing time in gaming history.
I take my hat off to those developers back then who, you know, in my mind, are some of the most creative people you could possibly be.
I think it's because, you know, we supported these games that we have such an amazing payday now, and we have such an amazing industry.
None of this would be here if it wasn't for that growth, that burst of creativity of those great personalities and companies that started really thinking about video games more as a form of entertainment rather than a diversion and something to swallow your coins at the arcade.
It's not just nostalgia, it's fact. The 80s were the most important decade in gaming. So don't talk to me about 4K tellies, solid-state drives, or teraflops. For true gaming, look no further than the 80s.